Sit back and listen to this extremely interesting story.
Beth glanced over at the clock before quietly slipping out of bed. She angrily looked over at her snoring husband before making her way out of the bedroom and down the stairs. She wasn't worried about him waking up. The 12 beers he drank plus the 3 sleeping pills she'd slipped him would keep him out for hours. With any luck, by the time he woke, she and the baby would be on the other side of the state. She poked her head in her daughter's room to make sure she was sleeping. Satisfied that she was and hoping she wouldn't wake up, Beth slipped on a long coat and walked out the front door and climbed into her SUV. It was about a 15-minute drive to her husband's police station, which gave her time to think. Why she married a charming bad boy and followed him to this small town, she will never know. A girl from a big city had no business in a city like this, even if she was married to the town sheriff. But she was trying to make it work, trying to be the best wife she could be, and her husband still cheated on her, and not only with one girl. By the time the private investigator got back to her, he had identified at least 10 other women he had been in contact with, some of whom she considered friends. By the time she'd pulled into the station parking lot, she'd worked herself into a fury thinking about it. Walking in the front door, she was greeted by an officer at the front desk. This time at night in this little town, there was only one on duty. He was a young, skinny kid who smiled wide when he saw it was Beth. "What are you doing here at this hour, Mrs. Lale?" And Beth smiled at the kid. "Hello, Sean. I told you to call me Beth, remember?" His smile broadened. "Okay, Beth, can I help you with something?" She could tell he had a crush on her, so she'd started to flirt with him a few weeks ago when she'd worked out this plan. Reaching across the table, she placed her hand on his and said, "I need a favor, Sean. I think my husband is up to something and I need to spend a little time in his office. I'll be as fast as I can and promise not to tell." Sean got visibly nervous. "I don't know, Beth. If you get caught, I'll be in big trouble." She smiled. "Honey, who's going to find out at this hour? I'll owe you one. Besides, I'm going to need a new friend when this is over," she said with an emphasis on friend. Sean's face grew red and he quickly nodded. "Okay, just this once. Make sure you don't tell anyone." Leaning in, she gave him a peck on the cheek before turning and heading towards the back. Sean was a nice kid and she felt bad about leading him on, but it was a necessary evil. Instead of heading towards her husband's office, she climbed the stairs to the security room that was filled with monitors and tape machines, recording what the cameras throughout the station were shooting. She quickly found the monitors and machines that recorded the cell in the lower room and paused briefly watching the 2 men sleeping in their cells. She'd overheard her husband earlier in the day bragging about how he'd arrested the 2 black men and knew that tonight was the night. She pushed the eject button, taking the disc out, and replaced it with a new one. The technology in the tiny station was about 20 years behind the times. Taking a deep breath, she turned, walking down the stairs, and headed towards the cells, stopping at the door to think one more time about what she was about to do. Fighting off a case of cold feet with the humiliation her husband had caused, she opened the door and locked it behind her. The noise from the door opening and closing woke the 2 prisoners who shot up out of their bunks. Beth just stood there with her hands on her hips, glancing back and forth at the 2 convicts, who, of course, knew exactly who she was. You didn't spend any time in this town without knowing who the sheriff's pretty blonde wife was. Tired of the awkward silence, one of them called out, "What do you want, girl?" Beth smiled at the big black with the shaved head in the left cell. She couldn't remember his name, but he was one scary-looking guy. At 6'5" and 265 pounds of solid muscle, he looked like he ate steroids for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. All he had on was a pair of dirty boxers, and his muscles rippled with every movement. "I'm just trying to decide which one of you I'm going to meet first," she replied with a smile. The 2 men looked at each other, confused. Beth turned her attention to the other prisoner and looked him up and down. He was almost as tall as the first, but skinny with long dreadlocks down past his shoulders. She couldn't have hand-picked 2 better guys to get back at her racist husband with. The fact that they were prisoners in his own jail just made it that much more effective. "I just can't decide, so I guess we'll just flip a coin, either of you want to call it," she said, pulling a quarter from her coat pocket. She looked back and forth between the 2 men. "No, fine, I'll call it myself. Your heads," she said, pointing to the Rastafarian. She threw the coin high in the air and let it fall to the ground. All 3 of them watched as it rolled on its side momentarily before stopping and tipping over. Beth looked down, then back at the skinny one and said, "I'm sorry it's tails, but don't worry, you'll get your turn." "What's going on here?" shouted Skinny. She laughed. "You 2 could not have picked a better time to get arrested." She reached out and undid her jacket, letting it fall to the ground. She smiled at the confused and shocked looks on their faces. She could practically feel the gazes of both men as they examined her from head to toe. She stood for a few minutes, then approached the first boy. He looked down at her and said, "You shouldn't come so close to me." She looked at him intently. "What, are you going to hurt me? I have a feeling that I know how to make you happy." He paused before asking, confused, "You want to please me?" She smiled. "Well, I wouldn't be standing in front of you without a jacket and bottoms, if not for now." He fell silent for a moment before coming close to her. "Then get to it, girl." It was Beth's turn to be impressed. The guy was in good condition. She had dated several men before she got married, but she had never seen anything like this. Sure, she'd heard stories and a couple of college girlfriends dating black jocks that confirmed them, but she definitely hadn't expected this. All she could do was look at him with wide eyes and mumble, "Wow." She began to please the prisoner. She remembered why she was here in the first place. Turning, she looked straight into the camera and smiled, then went back to business. The huge man gripped the bars and looked down as he watched the pretty blonde work. "Good job." Another inmate tried to see the action. "I can't believe that bitch is actually doing that." The big man ignored him and continued to spend time with Beth. He could not believe that this was the wife of that policeman. She continued the intimacy for several minutes when she felt him quicken his pace. She knew he was coming and didn't want him to come, but she pulled away and stood up. He was furious. "Why don't you continue?" She reached through the bars. "I'm sorry, honey. I just thought you might want me to come inside. I've got the keys." He stopped in shock. "Okay, then open the door." She laughed. "I'm not stupid, honey. I just want my husband to stay out of jail for letting two criminals get away. So here's how it will work. I'm going to handcuff you and you're going to go to your bunk and tie yourself to the bars. Remember, I'm a cop's wife and I'll know if you don't toughen it up. Then I'll unlock the door, we'll chat, and I'll lock it again when we're done." He thought about it for a second, then said, "So you leave me handcuffed to the bars all night?" "No, I wouldn't do that. Once I get the door locked, I'll toss you the keys and you can let yourself free. Then just toss the cuffs to your friend over there so he can have a turn." He thought about it for a second, then smiled. "You arranged all of this, didn't you?" "It seems that you are offended by your husband," she responded. "You have no idea." She walked over to the table, pulled some handcuffs out of a drawer, and tossed them to him. He thought for a moment. She wasn't usually interested in men like that, but she couldn't help but admire his physique. She watched him turn as he approached the bed, his thick, muscular cheeks seeming to flex with each step. She couldn't believe how fascinated she was by this man. He got down on his back and hooked one end of the cuffs to his arm and the other to the bars. Satisfied that he was safe, she opened the door and made sure to leave the keys on the table. Entering, she stopped at the edge of the bunk. She could not take her eyes off him and began to please the boy. After that, the boy took the initiative and already Beth was enjoying herself. Just a few minutes ago, the thought of intimacy with the convict would have made her sick, but being with him had affected her so much that it seemed natural. They spent a few more minutes together. As soon as they finished, Beth pressed herself against the boy, trying to catch her breath. "Okay, girl, it's my turn." "Hurry up, I've been waiting," shouted a guy from another cell. Beth looked at the other convict. She giggled, then bent down and worked with the first man again. "That was unbelievable, baby. I have honestly never felt like that before," she said as she pulled away and stood up. He watched her. She turned around and walked out of the cell, then turned and locked it. She quickly grabbed the keys and threw them to him. He unlocked himself, then threw the cuffs and keys into the other cell. The Rastafarian grabbed them and quickly cuffed himself to the bars, then tossed the keys to Beth. Beth was feeling the effects of her interaction with the boy as she unlocked the cell door. She stopped and smiled at him as he stood there. It wasn't as exciting as the other one, but it was definitely better than her former acquaintances. "Would you like a little help with that?" she said, then giggled. "Girl, I can barely contain myself." When she got close enough, he immediately pulled her close. It happened so quickly, she immediately began to please him. Beth got a little scared and tried to push him away, but he was too strong. Fortunately for Beth, he was satisfied quite quickly. But didn't end there. The boy wanted to spend more time with Beth. No, baby, I ain't done with you yet. You and I gonna spend a little time together." He pushed her to the floor and lay down there himself. They began to spend time together, and after the first boyfriend, things went faster. He had complete control over her, and Beth was a little scared. Beth was scared, but she liked it with the second guy. He continued to spend more than 30 minutes together. Beth loved every second and begged for more. When they finished, Beth tried to force herself to stand up. She was so weak that she had to hold on to the bars to keep from falling as she left the cell and closed it. She tossed the keys to the handcuffs, then leaned against the cell door, trying to catch her breath and regroup. "Hey, baby, I could use a little help over here," she heard to her left. The first was glued to the camera. He wanted to repeat their close communication. She stumbled over to him, giggling. "I'm sorry, honey, but you've made me tired. I'm exhausted." "Oh, come on, you can't leave me like this. Just work with me one more time." She paused, looking at him, remembering how good he made her feel. She came close and began to please the boy. Beth loved spending time with this guy. When they were done, they both fell to the floor trying to recover. After a minute or two, she struggled to her feet again. Beth leaned against the table, trying to catch her breath. She had never worked so hard or so many times in her life. She felt dizzy and her legs felt like jelly. She needed to take a nap. But she had spent too much time here and now she needed to hurry. Gathering her energy, she stood up and put her coat back on. Before leaving, she turned to the convicts and smiled. "Thank you, boys. You've been a big help in more ways than one. I had no idea." She turned and left, quickly climbing the stairs back up to the video room. She popped the new disc out, slipping it in her coat pocket, and replaced it with the old one. There'd obviously be some time missing, but didn't think anyone would notice. This wasn't exactly a high-security prison anyway. She left through the same door she'd come in and locked it behind her. Everything was exactly as it was before she'd got there, except, she figured, the jailbirds were a bit happier. She winked and waved at Sean as she walked by the front desk. She could tell he was upset she'd left so quickly. When she got home, she put on some cloths and quickly loaded the car with the bags she'd packed and hid earlier. She wasn't taking much. The fewer things to remind her about this place, the better. Quietly, Beth snuck into Jim's office and opened the hidden safe she wasn't supposed to know about. It was loaded with about $300,000 in cash and several files filled with some very important documents that she needed if she hoped to pull this off. After loading the cash and files into the car, she went back inside for the last time. On the kitchen table, she left divorce papers, the disc from the jail, the pictures taken of him at hotels with various women, and a piece of paper with the safe combination written on it. Last, she went into her daughter's room and slowly picked her up, trying not to wake her. Thank God Katie was a sound sleeper. She strapped her into the car seat and pulled out onto the road, with only one more stop to make. She was almost home free. As she drove, she tried to imagine what Jim would do when he woke up. He would immediately notice the photos and the divorce papers, then flip over when he saw the combination. She saw him running to the empty safe in a panic. Finally, he saw the disc, and Beth smiled at the thought. She was pretty sure he would destroy it before anyone else had a chance to see it. The last thing this racist would want is for people to know that his wife and the mother of his child spent time with 2 black inmates. Even so, it was worth it. She still didn't care what people in this town thought. 10 minutes later, at the edge of town, she pulled into an empty parking lot. Within seconds, a large man in a coat and hat walked up to her door and knocked on the window, and Beth rolled it down. "You're late, Mrs. Lale, and I'd almost given up on you," he said. "I'm sorry, something took a little more time than I thought," she said just before handing the investigator the files from the safe. He took the files and asked, "What exactly am I going to find in these?" Beth sighed hard, then looked him in the eye. "Oh, extortion, blackmail, theft, even murder. All the stuff you've been looking for, and plenty of things to put my husband away for a long time, hopefully forever." He nodded his head at her. "Thank you, Beth. I know this must not have been easy." She smirked. "Actually, it was a lot easier than you think. Once I realized the kind of man I was married to, I didn't care anymore. I just can't believe I let him fool me for so long." "Well, I can promise you he won't be causing you any more problems. I've got a judge just itching to issue an arrest warrant. He made a lot of enemies and now he's going to pay." She said goodbye, then pulled out of the parking lot. Beth glanced at her sleeping daughter, then turned left onto the highway heading out of town. She was going back to where she belonged, back to the city with her old friends and family, determined to forget this crummy little town and everything that happened in it.